McGee and Me is an American Christian television series created by Ken C. Johnson and Bill Myers, and premiering on June 4th, 1989. While the pilot episode aired as an ABC Weekend special, it was aired in its entirety on the Trinity Broadcasting Network. Even though the show only ran for 12 episodes, the series remains a familiar touchstone for faith-based programming. Produced and developed by Focus on the Family, a totally cool and chill company with no problems, McGee and Me acts as a series of after-school specials dealing with specific topics related to growing up. The main character, Nick, is faced with a moral dilemma in each episode, and by the end of the episode, a different biblical story helps Nick choose the right direction to take. Perhaps the most notable thing about this series is its impressively high production quality for faith-based programming. In fact, when the show was attempting to find placement on network TV, the editors just removed the more overt Christian conversations, and the show felt right at home on ABC's lineup. Another notable element of the show is Nick's imaginary friend, McGee, who is an animated character created by Nick and who serves as Nick's internal thought processes throughout each episode. McGee also lives through animated biblical illustrations with light comedic changes. Recently, I revisited this series after stumbling upon the whole thing on YouTube. I ended up rewatching all 12 episodes of the show, which range in production from 1989 to 1993. And over the course of this rewatch, I found myself getting more and more fascinated by the ethical positions this show poses for childhood audiences. While some of the lessons Nick learns throughout the series make sense for a young audience, like the problem with lying or the feelings of jealousy you get when another kid draws cartoon mascots. While every episode has a moment that hasn't aged well or displays the closed-minded worldview of 1990-era Focus on the Family, there are 3 episodes in particular I kind of want to dive into because I find their internal ethics interesting and, in some ways, indicative of a problem I have with this kind of moralistic, faith-based media. So let's get into it. The 3rd episode of McGee and Me is called The Not So Great Escape, and it centers around Nick's quest to sneak out of the house to see an R-rated movie called Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D, with music by a band called Death Threat. This movie sounds objectively awesome, and Nick is right to want to go see it. Nick's best friend, Lewis, is allowed to go see whatever movie he wants because his parents are chill. But when Nick asks his parents to see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4, his dad asks what the movie is rated. When Nick says the movie is rated R, his dad says, "No way." In the traditional opening section, Nick reads a verse from the Bible, and then his imaginary friend McGee acts out a short skit related to that verse. The verses for this episode are 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. Nick reads these verses aloud as McGee enters a Tower of Babel carnival full of seedy characters and cigar-chomping weirdos. The idea of this sketch is that McGee is a knucklehead for attempting to find any kind of fun or satisfaction in worldly games, and that he must instead find true happiness within the confines of God's natural world. The following episode, based on this thesis, should be about the secular world having no inherent internal value. However, in the following scene, Nick and Lewis are playing a fun game of laser gun murder when Nick's mom makes him come inside because it's getting late. Lewis makes fun of Nick for having to go inside so early. Lewis then looks through the newspaper and finds an advertisement for Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D with music by a band called Death Threat. When Lewis reminisces about Twilight of the Blood Freaks, Nick reminds Lewis that he wasn't allowed to see that movie either. Lewis tells Nick that he doesn't seem to be allowed to do anything, but Nick assures Lewis that he's a year older now, and he's probably allowed to see it. Nick is devastated because he wants to go see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D with music by a band called Death Threat, and he wants to go with Lewis, his more cultured friend. For Nick, it's not just about seeing the movie, it's about being independent and being treated like he can make his own choices.
I've seen all the freak movies.
Seen them?
You starred in them.
On the bus, Lewis performs some minor bullying, and all the kids at school talk about how they're excited to see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D. Of course, Nick's parents won't let him see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D, and he is devastated. Mom and Dad don't want Nick filling his mind with that kind of garbage. 4 minutes earlier in this episode, Nick was playing laser gun murder in his front yard with toy guns, helmets, and walkie-talkies provided by his parents. We are then treated to another McGee moment, where McGee tells Nick that he shouldn't fill his head with worldly thoughts, and then we're treated to a kind of funny Siskel and Ebert parody, which also features a film noir parody inside of it about the Maltese Falcon, or the Molting Falcon as this movie is called. This interlude shows both the original film and its remake, with the remake being violent and full of explosions. McGee comments that Nick should put his brain in a trash can. Lewis tells Nick over the phone that Nick should sneak out to go see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D. Nick agrees, and so he decides to come up with an incredibly complicated system of room security to break out of his house and see Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D with music by a band called Death Threat. I should point out here that Nick's inventions are a running element of this show, with the opening title theme displaying an enormous Rube Goldberg machine which acts as Nick's pencil sharpener. This episode's invention is similar to the one Ferris Bueller makes on his day off, where a decoy version of Nick seems to be working quietly in his room when in reality he's seeing Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4 in 3D. While Nick's family hears Nick from his room talk about how he's working diligently on some drawings, we know that Nick is actually hearing the awesome music of a band called Death Threat and the surround sound of a movie theater. While Nick is sneaking out, it's important to note that his sister, Sarah, is hanging curtains in her bedroom with her grandmother, and Nick's mother is ordering things for a giant party she's throwing later that week. At the theater, the kids see a rad marquee that I just want to point out, theaters should still do this. I would love to see personalized marquees for big horror films. Nick and Lewis use a smart tactic to get into the theater by pretending a man who just paid for himself is their dad, and the minimum wage cashier, realistically, doesn't care at all what movie these kids are seeing. But something's wrong. Once they're inside the theater, Nick doesn't like the movie. It's too gross. It seems like everybody in the theater thinks this movie is too gross, which is strange because this movie is called Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4. It's understandable that maybe Nick isn't into it, as he's never really seen anything like this before. Something happens in every episode of this show is the musical montage. Similar to the Rocky sequels, every episode climaxes with an original song set to a montage, and the song's lyrics usually coincide with whatever lesson Nick is learning. The lyrics here are, "They all said it was great. They all said it'd be cool. It's not at all what you thought it would be. Now you see you're a fool. What you see is what you get, so you better make sure that it's heaven sent. All the things that you see and hear will come back to you." When Nick returns home, his parents are waiting for him. They're upset that he saw the movie and filled his head with upsetting images of gore and violence. They tell him those images will never go away from his brain, and that he has literally dirtied his mind and soul. Okay, so this is a strange episode of television. I have some complicated thoughts about the ethical issues represented throughout, and especially how the mom and dad characters react to Nick's behavior. Based on the original thesis statement of McGee's trip to the Tower of Babel, the episode is about how worldly things will corrupt you and make you a worse person. But even that Tower of Babel sketch presents McGee as not enjoying the worldly pleasures he's experiencing. Instead, the Tower of Babel spits him out into a canyon. Similarly, Nick hates the movie he sneaks out to see. If we're thinking critically about the verse in question, John is talking about how the secular world entices us and makes us forget about God. However, the episode demonstrates how both McGee in his skit and Nick in the episode are repelled by the secular world. But that's kind of easy, isn't it? If you're teaching kids that the media they absorb has negative effects on their brain, shouldn't the episode use Lewis's many experiences of the Blood Freaks franchise to represent how broken his mind is? Lewis seems totally fine in this episode. When mom and dad tell Nick that his brain is irreparably damaged and dirty from seeing Night of the Blood Freaks Part 4, shouldn't they tell Nick about a time they too experienced something like that so he better understands? A stronger representation of this thesis would begin the episode with Nick watching the Blood Freaks trilogy in secret to prepare for Part 4. Maybe acting strangely because of the content in those episodes, or maybe even having nightmares, but then still wanting to see Part 4 anyway because he's getting corrupted. Maybe he does something violent, or he starts using harsher language, some sign that he's moving away from his family's values. Instead, this episode presents us with the best case scenario of what happens when a kid sees a movie that's full of what we would consider objectionable material. He just doesn't like it and has no interest in seeing more. If that was always true, why make the episode? What is the actual danger here? It doesn't seem to take into account that this movie theater is full of people who seem to be fine. Shouldn't we instead investigate the possibility that those worldly things are fun? And if they're fun, why should we avoid them? Additionally, what makes Blood Freaks inherently worse than being interested in hanging curtains or planning a big lavish party, or having a large middle-class house and a life filled with luxury items? Aren't all of these things equally of the world? And if Blood Freaks is obviously worse to the father without ever having seen it, how did he arrive at that valuation? If the Bible is also filled with violence and upsetting imagery, what differentiates that material from the material in Blood Freaks? As a high school English teacher, I find this episode annoying in its message. The parents aren't mad that Nick snuck out of the house or lied to them. The parents are mad because he watched Blood Freaks. I frequently receive emails from parents who don't want their children to read certain books under the same pretense as the one given in this episode. They don't want their children to be infected by evil ideas. But what happens when evil ideas are expressed anyway? How do you navigate those things if you've never experienced dealing with them? How do you determine for yourself whether something has value if you haven't experienced it? This kind of cultural insulation actively isolates young people from the foundational experiences they should have in adolescence, where they are greeted by complicated, confusing, confrontational subjects that they must then interact with critically. This way of thinking extends to an avoidance of all material you may disagree with without ever truly understanding it or observing it. And through that avoidance, you're plunging yourself into a constant state of ignorant paranoia about the world around you. The second episode I want to talk about is called Twister and Shout. This episode is based on Psalm 23, which Nick reads aloud while McGee is attacked by a giant freshwater lake tiger shark. In the real world, Nick and Lewis drink Shasta as Nick's parents prepare for an awards banquet. Nick's sister, Sarah, will be babysitting for Nick, Lewis, and their neighbor Renee while the parents are out of town. Sarah lays down her ground rules before the boys and girls get into a progressively escalating prank war. After Nick is drenched in water, he invents a clothesline that moves clothes around in front of a fan. Nick's and Sarah's parents, meanwhile, are 2 hours away at an awards ceremony for journalists, and Dad is up for a big prize for an article. Mom is concerned for the kids and lets her worrying ruin the night. That's when a storm begins. It's clear that this episode is leaning into the part of Psalm 23 about letting go of your worries and learning to trust in God, and that things will work out if you have faith. The mom is overly worried about the kids, and Nick is overly frightened of the storm. As the storm progresses, there's a running joke that what they're watching on TV relates to weather. First, they're watching Gone with the Wind. Later, they're watching Summer Breeze. There's a strange Wizard of Oz parody McGee dreams up involving a guy called the Lizard of Ooze. At the banquet, the storm gets worse. We learn that a tornado has been sighted close to Nick's house, and the parents talk about praying, which Renee's mother confesses to never doing. We also learn through Renee later in the episode that her mother is divorced. When the power goes out, Nick prays for God to take his fear away and to trust in him. When Nick and Sarah talk more about trusting in God around a candle, Lewis reveals that he, too, doesn't much believe in God. Nick and Sarah use this opportunity to evangelize to Lewis and Renee. This is the beginning of the most interesting part of the episode. Here we have a 14-year-old girl and 3 11-year-olds talking about the concept of fear. The entire episode is about fear, and the parents in this episode represent God. Sarah talks about a house she and Nick used to live in that had a scary heater that made creaking sounds. And Sarah reminds Nick that they had only heard the sound when the parents were not home. Renee then reveals that she only started hearing scary noises from her own house when her parents got divorced. The storm has ceased communication between the parents and the children, so their faith in their parents' safety is tested. Lewis and Renee then accept that God must be watching over them and protecting them. That's when a tree branch flies through the window of their house. Nick thinks quickly on his feet and becomes a great leader for the kids who are terrified of the storm. That's when this episode's musical montage begins, with the lyrics, "You will never be alone. That's what I tell myself at night." Through Nick's leadership, the kids are able to weather the storm through the night. The next morning, the parents arrive, and Nick takes credit for Lewis's work in fixing the window, which Lewis doesn't seem to mind at all. While Renee's mom comes to get her, Lewis's parents never appear in this show for unknown reasons. At the end of the episode, Sarah thanks Nick for his leadership qualities in dealing with the storm, and Nick is honored to receive her validation. The episode ends with Nick talking about how he takes his great life for granted. Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts about this episode, and they mostly relate to the way the episode interprets Psalm 23. Because the episode is aimed at white middle-class audiences in the early 90s, the stakes are pretty low, and the nature of this show's setting and protagonist seem to deliberately undercut the message of Psalm 23, so we end up with this kind of strange approach. Psalm 23 is written by David from the point of view of a sheep, and the Lord, in this case, is the shepherd, herding and protecting the sheep from harm. So, in this episode, Nick and his family are the sheep, and God is the shepherd, or Nick is the sheep, and the parents are the shepherds. The issue I have with this episode is that everything turns out okay. Psalm 23 is about death, and how God will guide sheep into death. They were meant to be eaten, and it's the shepherd's job to make sure the sheep are safe until they are slaughtered. The analogy then is that God will guide a human being from birth to death and then take care of them in death, and that death will serve a good purpose. In this episode, the kids are scared of a tornado, and when they pray, the tornado spares them. That's not what Psalm 23 is about. It's not about trusting God so he can save you. It's about trusting God that your death, when it comes, will have such significance and purpose that you shouldn't be afraid of it. I realize there are different ways a person could interpret Psalm 23, but the main conversations regarding God in this episode is that fear is a representation of distrust in God. Renee's mother isn't a proper Christian because she rarely prays, and Lewis isn't a proper Christian because he rarely thinks about God's protection. Nick and Sarah, however, understand that God will protect them if they trust and pray. But that's not at all how it works. You're setting the audience up for disappointment, and you're also creating this weird false dichotomy. When I first watched this episode at 7 or 8 years old, I understood the message of the episode to be that trusting God and believing in him would act as protection from the horrors of the world, and that your faith would help you weather storms, be it literal in this case or figurative. But just like poor Ann Putnam in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, who lost all of her children in childbirth, you're creating a dichotomy in which people who are fortunate are expressions of God's favor, and those who suffer lack the proper faith or conviction to be properly shielded by God's love. If God is sovereign, then God caused the tornado and the power outage and the loss of the phone signal. That means that this tornado, who potentially killed others in this episode, was part of the plan of God. and the episode's conversations imply that the people who died perhaps had too little faith, or that the people who were scared of losing their lives were wrong to feel fearful. This episode's message is clouded by the safe, middle-class banality of its characters, and its expression of Psalm 23 seems to entirely miss the point of the verse it's trying to teach. The final episode we're talking about today is really one of the weirdest episodes of television I've ever seen. In the season finale, 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas, 11-year-old Nick is introduced to gang violence, violence within a family, and the true meaning of Christmas. The episode starts with a special animated opening credit sequence, which takes the place of the Rube Goldberg machine and also takes the place of the skit that's usually involved in the opening moments, with McGee skiing around with various characters from all the skits of the previous episodes. The animation in this series is really good, considering the budget and pedigree of talent who were hired for this show. The character work is strong, the pacing and the timing of the slapstick is genuinely good. It's kind of shocking. This is the first episode in which Nick's voice is starting to crack, so his voiceover sounds really different from those first few episodes. It's strange though, because his voice is only deeper in the voiceover. In the episode itself, he still has his prepubescent pipes. I haven't mentioned him yet, but one of the main characters of this show is a bully named Derek, played by Johnny Green, who performs a hate crime in a previous episode. Derek has been held back, and he seems much older than the other kids in his grade. Before this episode, Derek has been a common obstacle for Nick. In one episode, he races Nick on a skateboard as part of a bet to stop bullying that kid from Jurassic Park who says dinosaurs aren't scary, and in other episodes, he's just kind of a presence of intimidation. In 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas, we get to know Derek much better. Apparently, behind the scenes, Johnny Green was caught smoking by Focus on the Family staff and was almost fired from the show, but the showrunner decided to instead give his character a bit of an arc in the back half of the season. In this episode, we begin with Nick and Derek's teacher committing a FERPA violation and then blackmailing Derek into performing in a Christmas pageant at his public school.
3 wise men we will have. Unless you want to be the first person in the history of Eastfield to take my class 3 years in a row.
The 90s were different. Derek isn't interested in being a wise man with Nick and Lewis, but if he doesn't show up to the pageant, he will have to repeat the 6th grade a 3rd time for some reason. Meanwhile, Nick takes Lewis to show off the Christmas music box he plans on buying his mom for Christmas, and Lewis is really into it. Nick has been saving his allowance for the music box, which is genuinely very sweet. But trouble is brewing elsewhere in this Christmas-themed general store. Derek and 2 grown men are shoplifting and making fun of Christmas. It's important to point out here that Derek is clearly hanging out with men who are at least twice his age. These guys are like in their late 30s, and both men are kind of dressed like Bill Paxton's character from The Terminator. Nick is surprised to notice that it's Derek who is also shoplifting, and it makes Nick realize that different people have different experiences. Nick's family lives inside of a Norman Rockwell painting, and it's clear that he's never really considered how different people are living different lives. On its own, this is a great lesson for any kid to learn, but this episode's just getting started. Nick is distraught about Derek, so his mom, a counselor, pulls out his emotions. Nick says it's too bad that not everybody can enjoy Christmas the way they do, and that Christmas is what God's love is all about, and everybody can experience it. Nick's mom reminds Nick that Jesus even forgave the thief on the cross. Nick's younger sister then says that one of the wise men in the family manger is lost, just like Derek. Nick's teacher is then pulled aside by the principal, and he kind of just publicly tells her that Derek is having a lot of trouble at home. This is another FERPA violation, by the way. But it's useful for Nick to hear about Derek's issues. He decides to go to Derek's house and try to talk to him about what's wrong. Nick visits Derek's house, which looks kind of like the apartment building in Blue Velvet, and Nick realizes that Derek is experiencing violence at home. Derek is crying and embarrassed to see Nick. Nick tells Derek that he cares about him, and Derek has no idea how to handle this. That's when Derek's much older friend, Ray, threatens Nick with violence? It's An extremely bizarre scene and also very upsetting, and it also reveals that Derek's life is obviously much more complicated than Nick's in basically every way. On the night of the pageant, Derek surprises everybody by showing up as one of the wise men. This episode, I should point out, did not start with a Bible verse, but Nick delivers a verse here during the pageant. This episode also does not have a fun musical montage, unfortunately. After the pageant, Nick buys his mom the music box, but behind the shop, Derek is getting beaten up by Ray. Derek wants out of the gang, and Ray, for some reason, blames Nick, who was literally just a guy in Derek's apartment building for a couple of minutes. Ray then sees Nick and targets him around the middle of town, and then he decides to beat Nick up, who is a tiny 11-year-old boy. The scene of Nick walking down the block to Carol of the Bells is reminiscent in both costuming and visuals of that scene in Home Alone before the fun part. Ray parks the car and he literally attacks Nick. The music box crashes into the ground, and it seems that Ray is about to murder Nick in this alleyway for no reason. But then Derek comes and saves the day. The shadowy photography and unnerving context of the scene make it kind of one of the best moments in the entire series. It feels genuinely violent. I don't know. It's like upsetting. It's like a nightmarish situation that comes out of like a Dickensian novel. Later, Nick gives his mom the music box and she likes it. Norman Rockwell painting, back to normal. Because this episode isn't based on a specific Bible verse, it's hard to know exactly what the thesis of this episode is beyond Christmas is good. Because the message is so simple, the episode works much better actually than the other two we talked about. Most importantly, the stakes go from being non-existent to weirdly high. Why is Ray willing to hurt this kid? What is the problem he has with Nick? How did Derek meet Ray? The characterization is kind of great when it comes to Derek, and in the follow-up series, The New Adventures of McGee and Me, Derek's arc continues from this point until he's one of Nick's closest friends and confidants. Johnny Green's performance is surprisingly deep, and this is far and away the best episode of the series. I'm just so confused by the specifics. Why is this public school holding a strongly Christian, Bible verse-laden Christmas pageant? Why is Derek's entire grade for his school year contingent on his participation as a wise man? If the school knows about Derek's home situation, why doesn't there seem to be some kind of intervention taking place? Why does the teacher still insist that Derek come to this pageant when she knows he's experiencing such hardship? While the material involving Derek and Ray is shocking and upsetting, it's even more shocking that Derek is so clearly being treated so badly by his parents, which Nick has a first-hand account of. Nick should report Derek's father at least, or tell his parents what he saw. Nick is accosted in the middle of town by an adult, and by the end of the episode, it seems that he hasn't really told anybody what happened and that he's just kind of gotten over it. If you're going to show this kind of material to your young audience, tell them exactly how to report these kinds of things to adults. What steps do you follow? How can you help them get out of that situation? Who should you talk to? McGee and Me only lasted for one season, and The New Adventures of McGee and Me were released as a handful of VHS releases. But if you're interested in checking out the other episodes, they're pretty easy to find on YouTube. Do any of you remember this show? What were some episodes that stuck out to you? How did you find this show? Did you watch it in Bible school? Where do you find episodes of this show? Anyway, let me know. That's really all I got.